Hello everyone, good afternoon and welcome to the webinar. We're really glad you're all here and thank you for taking up the time to attend this. My name is Shivanjali and I'm going to be your host for today. Whilst we're waiting for a few other people to join, I'd just like to take this opportunity to share with you all some of our socials. We've put them into barcodes for you all so you can conveniently scan it from your phone and just browse our socials and see if any of our content is of interest to you. It's also great that now we can do webinars and that way we can have people from all across the world. So please let us know in the comments where you're from. And in a few minutes, we'll also introduce our panel to you guys. We can see that a few people are joining us from India, so that's great. Some of them are from the UK, which of course we were expecting. Okay, great. Now let's move on to introducing our panel to you all. So today we are joined by Stuart. He is the Director at Transputec, and we're also joined by Neil, who is the co-founder and CEO at Brighthorse. Stuart, please would you introduce yourself to us all?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Stuart. I'm the Director of Services here at Transputec. So I'm responsible for all the services we deliver to our customers. And my main passion is around customer experience. So I look forward to discussing more of that with you later.
And Neil, could you please introduce yourself to us?
Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Neil Keating. I'm the co-founder and Chief Experience Officer at Brighthorse. We're a company that purely focuses on experience, employee experience and experience level agreements. I guess my aim really as part of the company is to help organizations change the way they report the success of IT by allowing them and enabling them to base it on experience metrics. So that's who I am and what I do.
Awesome. Thank you for that, guys. Now get into what we're going to discuss in today's webinar. So we've broken it up into sections. So firstly, we're going to be talking about experience, and followed by that, we're going to cover experience measurement, why it's important, how to measure, and then we're going to talk about how you can get started and what pitfalls you should avoid in that process. After that, we'll be talking about can you outsource experience, which I know is $1 million question. And then in the end, we will have some time for Q&As. So I request that all of you please put your questions into the comments section. Our comment section is being manned, so we will be able to answer your question in that section. And with that, let's begin. So let's begin with talking about what is experience. So I'd like to hand it over to Neil to talk about that.
Thanks, Shivanjali. I think when you think about experience really, if you boil it right down, and what we do when we talk to companies about experience, we try and boil it right down to its simplistic sense. If you do that, really, what experience is, it's about feelings, really. It's about how do people feel about you? How do they feel about your department? How do they feel about your organization? How do they feel about IT as a whole? How do they feel IT is enabling them to do their jobs, or is IT hindering them from doing their jobs? So that's its lowest form, really. It's about feelings. And when we say that to companies, what they often say back is, okay, well, therefore we need to make sure people are really happy with what we're doing. We need to delight everybody, and IT needs to make sure that everybody on the organization is delighted with IT. But the reality is you can't really do that. The reality is that you haven't got the budgets, you haven't got the resources, you haven't got the time constraints to be able to delight everybody. So we need to think of happiness, but we need to think of it in a different term. And psychology and some of the effective science that I'll talk about in a second has taught us that people don't need to be delighted. People don't need to be happy all the time. what people really want to do is be content. So the word I like to use is comfortable. So I'd like everyone to be comfortable with the webinar that we're doing here, because when you think about experience, if you're comfortable with what IT are bringing you, then you've got a solution that is fit for purpose. And the actual definition of quality is a solution that is fit for purpose. So therefore, if you are making your organization comfortable with IT, then you are delivering quality solutions. And that's the really most important thing. So I mentioned a moment ago about effective science, and effective science is a science that teaches us the difference between emotions and feelings, really. And as I said, experience is about how people feel. So emotions are a physical thing. So emotions are really something that you have, and you can measure them physically. Feelings are actually a logical thing. So when you ask someone how they feel, they're thinking logically. It's your brain applying your logic to something you've just experienced. So therefore, you can actually ask someone, well, how do you feel? How do you feel about this? How do you feel about that? How do you feel about how IT is performing for you? But when you do that, what actually that person does when they're thinking about feelings and you ask them that question, they're balancing off in their mind all the positive and all the negative things that have happened to them over time. So they think about all the interactions that they've had with you for however long they've had those interactions with you for, 2 months, 3 years, if it's a single transaction, a minute. But typically with IT, it's happening all the time and over time. So therefore, they're balancing those transactions. And when you ask someone how they feel, what they're doing is they're balancing the positives, they're balancing the negatives with you, and they come up to a conclusion. Now, clearly, recent events will take higher currency. So if the systems have gone down or you've performed badly or whatever it might be, then they have that in the forefront of their mind. But even then, what someone does is think about, well, I've been with you for 2.5 years, for example, and actually, things have been pretty good. I know the last couple of weeks have been difficult, but it's been pretty good up to that point. So therefore, they may not be delighted, but they will be, back to that word I used a few moments ago, comfortable. And that's what people think when you ask them how they feel. You're thinking about all those interactions they've had, and you want them to feel comfortable. But the key thing there is that experience is cumulative. People balance off this over time. So we need to think about measuring experience cumulatively, and we need to think about it's not about delighting people. So when we think about we need to deliver experience and we need to measure experience, we're measuring how people feel, and we're trying to make sure they at least feel comfortable. And that's how we define experience, really.
Right. Thank you for that, Neil. And what would you say digital experiences?
Well, so there's a lot of talk now about digital experience out in the marketplace. More and more organizations are moving towards some form of digital experience. And when I mentioned experience, I mean, experience can cover lots of things. So when you think about experience in an organization, there's experience with HR, there's experience with finance, there's experience with your managers, your leadership team. And I guess a lot of these people on the call here today will be thinking at it from an IT perspective. So there's an experience with IT. And part of that experience with IT is what we call digital experience. So I like to think of digital experience really as covering all the interactions that your employees, that your people you serve and you provide IT to, have at work when they're doing their daily job. Now that is quite difficult. That can be quite challenging, because if you think about all the interactions people have with all the technology in front of them, all the technology and services they use, that means digital experience is part of the overall experience journey, but it's very, very broad in its own right. Think about how many applications you use in your daily job. Think about all the devices you might use in your daily role. Think about your devices, your mobile device, your laptop or your desktop, the websites you might have to go through, your office application suites, business applications, social media tools, presentation tools like the one we're on today, LinkedIn like we're on today, collaboration, email, etc. Normally, we now have to start thinking about, well, how do all of those technologies and all of those devices work with those technologies? And if you think back, and you don't have to think back long here, but most of the time, 5 or 6 years ago, most people in organizations felt we need to measure the data center, and we'll measure whether the network's up, and we'll measure whether the server's up, and we'll think about whether applications are available. But now we've recognized that there's a lot of things in the way between that person and even getting to the data center. So it's become much more complex, and we're thinking about measuring all of those different things and stacking all of those things up together. And then you're starting to see that's getting quite confusing. There's more and more vendors on the market. digital experience isn't particularly new. It's been around for a long time. But what has happened is as IT has moved from what we call the service economy with SLAs and KPIs into the experience economy, we're seeing that digital experience is a big growth area because organizations are having to shift from command and control centric organization IT to much more people centric. And people are having to sit there and think, if I provide you with this device, if I provide you with this camera, if I provide you with this email system or a social media tool, does it do what you want it to do? Does it do everything you want it to do? Is it available to you on the devices you want it to be available on and the time you want it to be available for? And very importantly, is this really easy to use? Is it intuitive or do you need to think about it? And I guess, that's really what a lot of organizations are doing, which is why you're seeing more and more companies coming on the market and talking about digital experience, because pretty much everybody at your work, pretty much everyone I'm involved with has IT as part of their daily jobs. And that means they have digital experience as part of their daily jobs. And I guess what organizations are now realizing is, given all the constraints, everything we've got, do we want to design that and make that experience good? Or do we just want to let it happen by accident? And most organizations are saying, actually, we want to design it. And let's think about how we can improve someone's digital experience because we want to improve their productivity.
Right, thanks for that, Neil. And Stuart, what would you say the additional mechanisms are?
Well, it's very interesting actually, because we often talk, or I hear people talking about customer satisfaction, customer experience, and customer engagement all in the same breath or context. But actually, I don't think it's actually the same. They're very different elements to an overall satisfaction and experience. Now, experience needs very much a layered approach, but it doesn't replace all the traditional methods. It sort of augments what we've done historically. So if I quickly just talk through in my experience from a service provider throughout the last 20-25 years, a lot of these traditional methods include things like customer satisfaction. Now, customer satisfaction is quite broad and there's no one way to achieving that, but often it's quite a niche approach. It's quite anonymous, it's quite transactional. And that could be, for example, from your ITSM tool, your tickets, you get some feedback, a score or smiley face, etc. But it's very transactional and point in time. And actually, there's no context to that. As Neil just mentioned, that the most recent experience clouds the previous exposure. So generally, customer satisfaction is talked about from that perspective. We then move on to things like KPIs. And for those that are dealing with service providers or even internally, KPIs around what customers want to be happy about. So that could be, for example, a KPI around the number of positive surveys that we receive. So it could be very much a volumetric type KPI, but it's very crude. It's very simplistic, but very crude method of actually assessing how the end users feel or your customers. If we move to now through more recent times, there's a concept and framework which actually a lot of organizations globally are adopting, which is moving more towards experience, but not quite there. It's called the Net Promoter Score, or NPS. And basically that's solely based on questions which are responded to and scored against. Are you a promoter or are you a detractor? So you might ask a question, would you recommend us, etc. And you have people that are neutral, so they don't count, and scores for whether you promote or detract. But the people have to score you very highly to be a promoter or very lowly to be a detractor. So it's still quite a crude mechanism, but it's leading more towards experience. And I think you have to layer some of these, and it's about a blended approach to getting experience. So we'll talk later about how you start and build experience level agreements. But the experience level agreements are there to build upon some of these traditional methods. You may be comfortable with them. You may be wanting to look at different mechanisms, but all of them have their place. But there's a pros and cons to each experience and customer satisfaction technique.
Right. Thank you for that. Moving on, let's now cover experience measurement. So I'd like to pass the question over to Neil to get us started. What is DEX?
So it's a bit about what I was saying before. DX traditionally stands for digital employee experience. So that's what the term stands for. You hear it as well. You might see DEM quite a bit. Digital experience management. They're kind of a little bit interchangeable. but both are really about how you're measuring that journey that someone has with across their what we call their digital workspace. So all the devices, all the applications, all the things they use to do their job. So the key thing is more and more companies are doing it. Gartner said something interesting recently that they believe that by 2025, I think it was, that 50% of organizations will be measuring some form of digital experience by 2025, and that's up from in 2021 that was 5%. So that's a huge growth in organizations going towards digital experience and digital experience management, and we see that a lot. We see more and more companies putting in titles and roles. We see more and more companies with job titles like mine, Chief Experience Officer or XMO Manager or End User Computing or End User Experience Manager. So that's what we're seeing. But as I said, the problem with DEX, I said before, it's quite wide. So what organizations need to think about is where are you going to get the best return on your investment? Where are you going to spend some money thinking about measuring DEX? Where should you start with all those things in between a user and a data center? And in my view, where I see a lot of organizations doing it is where they get most interactions. And most interactions are around their devices, around their mobiles, around their core business applications. So they're finding tools that might help them measure how does someone interact with that device? How does someone interact with the core business applications that we're asking them to use for a daily job? But the key thing is when you think about DEX is you need a measurement. So you need a score. So you need somehow to be able to track all of the things that I call them end users, customers, employees, but you need to track all the things that an end user is doing and where's the pitfalls, where are the issues, all the things that Stuart was mentioned a few moments ago about where some of the other traditional metrics perhaps don't stand up. But the key thing is you need a score. Otherwise, it's a bit like going to a doctor's and saying, I feel slightly warm. And the doctor says, yeah, you are quite warm. You kind of want to know on what scale you feel warm and where do other people sit with that as well. You know, what are other people's scores? So if I'm 8 out of 10, well, is that good? Is that bad? What does that mean? So it's really important that we have that score so we can start improving things. And that's really what DEX brings you. DEX will bring you a score. And there's massive improvements you can make if you get it right. Lots of now independent analysts out in the market telling you that, you know, if you allow your employees to be engaged, you know, engaged employees are 21% more productive than disengaged employees. Disengaged employees cost the UK economy £340 billion a year. So these are big, big numbers now that people are worried about and thinking about. And I guess when you look at most employees that use laptops, desktops, and probably lots of people on this call, employees are actually one of the only appreciating assets an organization has. You know, when we buy lots of software, hardware, and machinery, it's worth less when we installed it than it is when we bought it. But if you think about an employee, they're worth more year on year because they've got higher knowledge, they've got more experience. So therefore they appreciate. And the thing is, if we believe that and we get that and we understand that, then we've got to make sure that those people in our organization are productive. We've got to make sure that IT is providing the things that they can use and IT is helping them. So you've got to start seeing that in your organization. So that's what we see. I don't know, Stuart, you see it with your customers. What do you see? Do you see something different, or is that about right?
Yeah, I think that's right, Neil. I mean, what we see is it can be very endpoint focused when we talk about digital services. And we often find we're currently consuming services in silos. So, for example, you may have applications and tooling which provide you data, but it's all in silos. So you might have a ITSM tool, you might have an application management service, you might have an RMM. And this gives you all discrete silo-based information. And what we need to do to form more of this experience is to integrate all these to assess that experience. That's the key to getting that DX, as we call it.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. So where does that fit with XLAs then? You've put those in place. What do you think about those?
So, I mean, well, thanks, Neil. That leads nicely into what is an XLA. And maybe if I sort of give my take on what an XLA is all about, or an experience level agreement. Experience level agreements are not a replacement for SLAs. I've mentioned before augmentation. But they're sort of, I suppose I'll call it a reimagining of SLAs. But what they do is they focus on what's more important to end users, not what's more important for the IT department or the procurement team or the IT director. It's what is important to that end user of that service. The XLA targets are very end user centric metrics and leverage KPIs that focus on perceived quality of IT services and support. And perception is key in all this. How do we quantify perception? And we'll come on to concepts of watermelon, etc. later. They measure the performance of IT by quantifying that end user, allowing us to give an outcome and measure that against the defined outcome. So if I was to define an XLA in one sentence, it would be an experience level agreement is that commitment to delivering a defined experience with experience indicators as the measures. So we all know what we're signed up to and what the outcomes will be and what good looks like from an experience perspective.
Yeah.
Often XLAs are much broader in scope than service level agreements or SLAs. They may cover projects, they may cover whole services, and obviously experience. And they're generally based upon an experience ambition or statement, which will come on to what that means shortly. And so what you find is experience, as I mentioned, is rather horizontal across the services rather than vertical in silos. Now, just an important point I want to make is XLAs are there to understand your performance and the experience you're providing. Now, you can actually do something with that XLA information, or you can just sit on it and do nothing, but at least you know. So it's not forcing you to actually take action. If you're augmenting your SLAs with XLAs, it could be that you just want to understand. But actually, I think if you're going to implement these experience level agreements, there's an indirect next action, which is you're going to want to do something about it once you've got that data, because data drives actions and decisions and probably drives more data analysis. Neil, any thoughts on that?
Well, I think you summarised it quite well, actually, Stuart. I think you were saying about the other tools earlier, NPS and CSAT and KPIs. The way I look at that, because you mentioned the word outcomes, it made me think of something. Those really driving outputs, right? So all those SLAs, KPIs, and CSATs particularly, they just drive an output. And actually, what organisations are starting to want now is outcomes. And that's really, as you said, that's really what an XLA really is. It's about a joint commitment to a particular outcome that the organisation needs to want to produce. The experience that they want to stage is what the words we call it. What's the outcomes that you want to provide your customers or your employees? What do they need to do their job? So we need to decide, first of all, what the outcomes are. And you said that, you write that down in a statement of some sort. That's the XLA statement that you talked about. And then you can start thinking, well, how are we going to understand that? How are we going to see whether we're delivering that? How do people feel about whether we're delivering that outcome? And that's really the XLA. And I like the point there that, you don't have to publish all this stuff. You don't have to show to the business, but it's for you. You can if you want to, but it allows you to then take an action to make sure you're continually driving outcomes. And I think that's the key thing. I think you covered it well. It was a good summary, I think.
Awesome. And Stuart, can you also talk to us a little bit more about XLA's importance?
Yes. I think for any business stakeholder and people attending this webinar, you've got to ask yourself, is user experience and engagement important to your business? If it's not, then you've got to ask yourself, why not? And it may be that the outcome of that business output lends itself to not needing an experience. You could be a very sales-focused organisation or producing widgets, and it's just a repetition. But you also got to ask yourself, do you want a partnership? So do you want to understand user experience? Do you want to understand how to engage better? And do you want a partnership? And if that's important to you, then you need to choose an MSP and a partner that can deliver, as Neil mentioned, key outcomes, not just the typical contractual SLAs and KPIs. And you need to have a passion for experience, the MSP, not just ensuring the SLAs are green. And the reason is often the SLAs and KPIs are dictated to by the customer or the IT department. This is what we want, this is what we're going to have. Whereas actually experience is much broader than that. It's an engagement, collaboration of what the user experience should be. So it's taking that, we're enforcing this upon you to a collaborative approach. And nowadays, certainly with post-pandemic, there's far more a focus on broader receivers of service, not just the IT lead or not just procurement or the service manager. It's far broader. Everybody's got an input and a voice. Now, I remember probably going back now, probably 15, 16, even more years ago, I went to a customer meeting and been looking at all the data, and we had all the service reviews and all the SLAs and KPIs all showing green. And we went down, and the IT director was very simple and said, love that it's all green, but my end users have given me feedback that it's actually not meeting their needs. And this IT director was very much ahead of the time. And so said, well, I know I've contracted you to do this, and I penalise you if you don't hit them, but how can we work together to actually start doing what the business wants and the end user experience? And that was many years ago. They understood, actually, you've got to keep the user base and the customers on board rather than just dictating, this is what's going to happen, this is what you should expect. So I think that watermelon effect of everything looks green, but it's red on the inside, which is a concept of customer satisfaction and customer engagement and experience. That's really important that we take away from a technical perspective, technical SLAs, technical KPIs, availability, is this performing, round trip, mean time to failures, through to an experience. And I think examples of changing our approach in this arena, certainly for managed service providers and Transputec, is that we've gone from very technical, for example, implementation of projects, technical measures, we would deliver this outcome, that, to very much adoption techniques. Okay, we've implemented that technology, but what about the adoption of that technology? What's the value the business gets from it? And before, ROI was very much based on far more technical approaches. Now the ROI is seen as adoption. Are my users now using the full collaboration tools, for example, of Teams, rather than just email and instant messaging? That's an adoption. How are they leveraging that, and how much is that bringing efficiencies? Neil, any experiences that you found in this area?
Yeah, well, lots actually. I mean, I'm conscious a little bit of time. I think Shivanjali is probably going to tell us to move on and think about how we implement this in a second. So I know people will want to do that. But yeah, I think what you're saying really is that experience has consequences. If you don't get it right, then people will vote with their feet, vote with their wallet, and they will ignore you, or they'll go somewhere else. And even if they can't choose a different IT department, whatever, the rise of shadow IT tells me that if you don't do some of the things you were talking about there, Stuart, then people will ignore you. I mean, it's easy for an FD to go and get an application on the web and say, you didn't give me what I needed, so I'm going to ignore you, and it's £50 a month on my credit card. You didn't give me the outcomes I wanted. So it matters. If you don't give people what they want, they will ignore you, or they will leave your organization. Maybe even worse than leaving your organization, they'll stay there but ignore you. So yeah, I think that's really important stuff there. Yeah.
Thank you. And now I think let's move on to how somebody can get started if they wanted to begin. And I'd pass this over to Stuart.
Thank you. I think I want to go through a bit of theory first before I want to talk about real world experience that Transputec has gained in this area and how we did it. That may not be necessarily the same for everybody else, but I'll talk through our real world examples. So just going back to the sort of theory, where you start is obviously going to depend on your existing customer experience maturity, your employee experience maturity. We talked about some of the traditional mechanisms. Where are you in that process? If you've got nothing, then obviously you're starting far early in that process. And if I talk about the history from Transputec, when I first joined Transputec probably 5 years ago, we had a customer satisfaction team. We called it this customer satisfaction team. And that evolution has happened over time, from transactional surveys and making sure we call people back if they give us a red response so they know that we're responding, through now to the adoption of net promoter scores, and ultimately now evolving into our development of our experience management office, or XMO. So we're taking a far more proactive approach to the experience and the experience measures. So how do you set up you start with what's called an ambition statement, an XLA ambition statement. And I'll talk through the theory about where we start with that, and then I'll talk about how we did it. So normally, when you're looking to build an ambition statement, you start with reviewing your experience now for the services that you cover. What are your customers telling you? Have you got any data? And can you categorize it? That's your starting point. And most organizations have that. You then look at the experience ambitions. What outcomes based on that data do you think you'd like to deliver? List out the outcomes that you want to give to people and use the data as your wants and needs. Then you need to sort of filter and prioritize. Can you control this? Are you fully in control? Is it within your sphere of influence? With anything in life, can you make them smart? Specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. Can you actually deliver them? And what are the top priorities? And from that, you then start to wheedle out a summary statement from this list about what the ambition should be. So that's the sort of stepping stones in theory of what to do. If we talk about what we did as an organisation, so I remember our very first experience of developing our very first XLA and ambition statement. What we first did, we thought about as the experience team, thought about who was the right customer to work with on this opportunity, because we very much wanted a customer that was very focused on their employee experience, and we very much wanted to focus on a customer that was very engaged and worked collaboratively in partnership, because that would make the whole journey easier, because we were learning and we wanted the customer to learn at the same time. So we chose a particular customer that was ready and willing. We thought could be an early adopter. And what we did the analysis of data, and we went through some of the problem management, some of the themes and trends. We did this in isolation within Transputec first, with the service delivery manager for that account and some key stakeholders. And we whiteboarded all the areas where we feel they've given us vocalization, either the end user in the surveys and the feedback, the stakeholders themselves, and we listed them all out. And gradually we came to some themes. And what we then had to do is we drew together all the themes, we filtered them as I described in the theory, and all of a sudden we started to see a sort of ambition statement, which included things like around verbal communication, speed of response, things like that. And quickly we were able to very roughly draft an ambition statement, which we felt was in tune with that customer, may be in tune with that customer. So once we drafted it, we started to work out and think, well, how do we measure this then? And we quickly worked out, based on that statement, we can do it through some technical measures. We had existing monitoring tools, which would give us some technical measures. And then what sort of survey questions would we do to get the emotional side, the perception side? And so we came up with about 5 survey questions, which are about how do you feel about this? What does this mean to you? Those sorts of emotional questions. And we came up with 3 or 4 technical measures. And then what we looked at was how we weight those to really weight the emotional measures higher than the technical measures. And then the next step, once we'd come up with that, was to sit down with the customer and say, look, this is the concept. This is the journey we're going on as an MSP. Is this a value to yourself? And we workshopped and went through all the data we'd gone through, and the customer concurred with it. We tweaked it slightly in terms of the ambition statement. And we were then able to go to the next stage, which was actually get the calculation framework together. So we could put all this data in once we do all the surveys, get the technical measures, and agree what's called the XLA measures, what good and bad looks like. And through that process of starting ourselves, because we were learning, engagement with the customer, making sure that we really would provide value for them, getting an ambition statement which is measurable both technically and emotionally, so we can quantify it. That was the way we were able to launch our first XLA. And I suspect a lot of those techniques you can apply to most organizations. Now, if we do our next one, we'd probably do that workshop straight away with the customer. But the first thing you need to do is to make sure the customer understands what experience will bring to them. So that's our, I suppose, as a managed service provider, our experience of starting our first XLAs and how we engaged. Neil, maybe from your perspective as an experience expert.
I think you've covered a lot there. I think that's very interesting. I agree with you. I mean, the first thing you've got to do is think through what experience outcomes you have. I mean, most people have lots of operational data and technical measures, the things you were talking about there, Stuart. I guess I see the complexity in just thinking, well, what is the ambition? And I think you did a good process to get to that, because once you've got that ambition, you can then start saying, well, how am I going to measure that? You know, what technical measures have I got that impact that? What operational measures have I got that might impact that? What questions might I ask people that impact that? So yeah, I think you've covered it well there. I was going to ask you a couple of questions, I'll save them to the end, but there was some interesting things there about how you kind of went through the process. Because I think you can repeat, once you've done it once, you could probably repeat a lot of that and it will become easier again next time, I think. So yeah, very good. Siobhan, should we move on to the next question?
Yes, please. Can you please also talk to us about the different types of XLA?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess when Stuart was talking there, it sort of struck me about maturity in customers, really. And Stuart was talking about really kind of how the customers that you pitch, you work with start off with, and where they are in that maturity and where their views of XLAs are. And when we started out doing experience level agreements for organization, I genuinely thought there was only one type of XLA. I genuinely thought, oh, this is it. There's only one type, and we'll just repeat and do that across lots of other companies. And I think Stuart's right in what he said, that there are elements that you do that repeat across other companies, but there's elements that are unique to what that customer is about. Stuart was talking about there about his customer and how they got to the ambitions for that customer, and that might be subtly different to the other customer. So there's unique bits, and there's probably more repeatable elements of it. But if you think through the different types, we've quickly learned that you've got internal customers who have an XLA with their own employees. So if I was a shoe manufacturer, I'd put an experience level agreement in to my employees because I inherently know what those people need to make shoes, right? So I know what they need from IT to be able to do that. So that's one route to do it. But Stuart described a different route, which was about an outsourcing company then having a measure in with their customer employees. Now, it might look the same, because actually when Stuart was describing how that XLA looked, that's exactly the same as XLAs I've put in for internal departments. But getting there for Stuart was slightly different than an internal department would do. So Stuart doesn't, and his team there, don't always have access to all those employees all the time. So it's working with the customer, sort of hand in glove there. So it's a different route to it. But then you've also got maybe an internal team, an internal organization having an XLA with their supplier. So how does their supplier work with them? How do they feel about working with their supplier? Is that supplier doing what's right for their business or just what's right for their contract? So they're kind of different ones about the difference between outsourcing and maybe internal departments. But we've also spent a lot of time in projects, and a lot of organizations now put XLA in projects. Traditional measures for projects have always been, is that project delivered on time? Was that project delivered on in cost? Yeah. What we're now saying is, of course, it's important to be done on time. Of course, it's important to be done within budget. But it's, if not more important, at least equally important, that the outcomes of that project actually work. So let's put an XLA around the outcomes of that project. Is that project successful? Did we do it for the right reasons? And have we achieved something good here? You've also got, as you can see on the screen here, different maturity versions of XLAs as well. So you've got XLA 1.0, which is really just sentiment only. So some organizations will say, you know what, I really want to start my XLA journey off. I just want to get some sentiment. Brilliant. We call that XLA 1.0. XLA 2.0 is what Stuart was talking about there, which is the multi-channel. I'm going to get sentiment, but that, because sentiment tells me what people feel, but I want to understand why they feel that way. So I'm going to use ODE data, operational data, and these technical measures as well to give me some context to why they might feel that way. And then you've got XLA now 3.0, which is another maturity step, was saying, actually, I'm doing this for this organization, but could I do it for bits of that organization? Maybe the scientists in this healthcare organization need a different experience to the HR team. We can start thinking about persona XLA as well, really. So yeah, lots of different types. And I think it's good for the market, good for maturity, but it's just about working out which is the right type for that organization, I think.
Right. Thank you for that, Neil. And just before we move to the next section, I just wanted to take this opportunity to let you all know that we have created a white paper for you all in which we go into much more depth about all the topics that we're talking about here. We've also added a few free resources if you're getting started about questions you should ask your provider to ensure that your partnership is good and that you get the most out of it. So please check out our emails and you will have access to those there. Moving on to the next section, let's discuss some of the pitfalls that you should be avoiding. And Neil, I'd like to pass this question on to you.
Sure. Yeah. And again, there's lots. And for anybody who's thinking about doing this and thinking about I'm going to put it in place, do contact Stuart or myself afterwards, and we can help you with a bit more about this, because there is a lot of pitfalls to avoid, really. For me, a couple of really important ones. Organizations not being ready. So we often see organizations say, I love the sound of XLAs, I really want to implement them, but their IT teams aren't quite ready for that. And what I mean by that is, we always say to an organization, you kind of need to have IT under control. So for those of you who know about the CMMI level, you need to be at level 3 under control. If you're not, you're already delivering bad experience. So you probably don't need experience management on top of that until you've got a repeatable under control IT system. So that's the first thing. Then you've got things like, not having enough organizational backing. We have champions in businesses that really want to put in experience level agreements. But if they don't have the backing of everybody else in that chain, then the ambitions that Stuart was talking about earlier and the outcomes that we were describing, you're probably going to fail. Because if you think about onboarding as an XLA, there's lots of people who might be involved in that. And if they're not all on board, then you won't achieve your ambition. So there's issues about, you know, making sure that you've got the organization backing, make sure your organization is ready. But assuming you are ready and assuming you're going to do it, then you've got to start thinking about, well, how am I going to get decent sentiment data? And there's lots and lots and lots of best practice. We could do another webinar on best practices for surveys and getting data, things like mode, timing, day of the week to send it, how many questions to ask, design. All of that needs to be taken into consideration alongside making sure the data is statistically valid as well. So lots of pitfalls in there. One more, because I've just talked about surveys, but one of the big ones I see is that IT teams do a survey. They do all the things I've just said. They're all ready. They take the survey and then they look at the data and go, no, that's not really true. No, that's not how it is. And I think Stuart said, well, he said, perception is reality. So you need to make sure that you believe what people are saying to you, even if you disagree with some elements of it, but that is their reality. That's their perception. That's how I see it. I know, Stuart, do you see that, or do you see different ones, or where do you see that?
Yeah, I think that's a very good overview of the typical pitfalls. I think I'd only add, and I've mentioned this earlier, is engagement and collaborative working together and openly on XLAs is a must. It's not like the SLAs, which are just dictated by one party, often the legal team or a procurement team from the customer. So that collaboration, otherwise it's much harder to get this off the ground. Clearly, you need to educate the stakeholders on the value of XLAs and the whole process, so they understand the journey you're going on. So outline that, educate, especially if they're used to sort of managing suppliers or third parties through SLAs and KPIs. Because as I mentioned before, SLAs and KPIs are typically used in a punitive manner. You don't hit them, I punish you, and whatever mechanism there is. And the whole concept of XLA is about reward, incentivization. So with that in mind, you need to agree what does reward or incentive look like for your organization and for your partner who achieves the XLA. And that could be various and varied. It could be through from SLA relaxation, payments, mutual projects. It'd be very bespoke to your organization and what you want to do with your partner or suppliers and stakeholders in that. I think my advice is start simple. Don't treat XLAs like an SLA or KPI, which never change. XLAs are iterative. They have to evolve and will change far more often. Typically SLAs and KPIs are defined at the start of the contract and then only reviewed through a contract renewal. XLAs have to be treated very differently. And this is why we've set up our XMO, our Experience Management Office, is to constantly look at, are they still fit for purpose? Have we achieved the outcome? And hence, let's look somewhere else where the experience is not so good. So you've got to regularly review, update, enhance, amend, and don't keep the same measures long term. Because if the long term, then you're not obviously delivering that experience if you're having to adhere to them for a long period of time. So I think those are other areas I would suggest, or pitfalls or advice when you're going through this journey.
No, I think that's good. Good recommendations.
Okay, thank you for that. And now I'd like to move on to the next question, which I know is really popular, and that is, can you outsource experience? So Stuart, I'd like you to start this section off, please.
It's an interesting question, actually. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer. I'm going to say yes, technically you can, but no, I wouldn't recommend you do. And what I mean by that is, for the reasons I've outlined previously, this was all dependent upon the culture of the two parties that come together, the relationship, the working relationship, the partnership. You need that joint collaboration, the culture, the customer experience maturity. And it's very much, my teams will know, and I mention a lot, the partnership approach versus the client-supplier relationship. And it's very different. You've got to work in partnership to develop shared outcomes, shared visions, not have a client-supplier relationship where you're told what to deliver, how to deliver it, and punished if you don't. That doesn't engender that experience. Because we talk about experience, there's an experience between a customer and a supplier as well, and you want that experience to be good. So I would say technically you could, if that's what you want as an organization and you could technically, but I would suggest you've got a much greater degree of success if you do it in a partnership and do it together as a collaboration. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I agree. When you originally said yes and no, I was thinking to myself, what would I think about that? But I think you're right. It's kind of a yes and no answer, really, isn't it? So I think you probably can outsource lots of elements of experience, actually. So I think you can outsource the measuring of experience, for example. That can be definitely outsourced. I think you can outsource the improvement of experience findings. That can definitely be outsourced. But I think I agree with your point there, Stuart, which is it is a joint commitment. So I think when you're thinking about what's the outcomes we're trying to drive, what's our ambition, what's we're trying to achieve here at this shoe manufacturing company, whatever it is, then I think that's kind of, you've got a working partnership with your outsourcer to do that. So I think you need to be working together to say, well, what outcomes can we drive together? And I think as an organization, although your outsourcing partner can do a lot of this, but as your organization, you've got to recognize that even you might have to fund some things as well. So for example, you might find that processes need to change or policies need to change, and that might be down to the organization to do. So I don't think an outsourcer can do it entirely on their own. I think that's Stuart's point. I agree. I think the organization needs to own elements of it, and certainly with their ambitions and what they're trying to achieve. But once you've done that, you can work with the organization like Transputec to try and make sure this is going to happen for them. And I think a lot of organizations will struggle and do struggle to continually measure and improve. Well, Transputec's got an XMO, for example, so you could buy into that concept and ask your outsourcer to say, right, here's our ambitions, this is what we're trying to achieve. Can you help us deliver those experiences and help us along the way to get there? So yes, I think you can outsource it, but yes, it is a joint experience, joint commitment as well. And so you can't devolve ownership of experience, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Great. Thank you both for sharing that. Just before we move on to the Q&A section, I just wanted to ask both of you if there's anything you'd like to add just to wrap this up.
From us, Siobhan, Charlie, do you ask?
Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry,
yeah, I think it's for me, the only thing I'd add, I think we've covered a lot of ground here, so I think that's really interesting and very important. And I think for me, the big takeaway I would say from a hopefully people who are listening would be, there's a lot you can do with experience. There's a lot you can improve experience with. There's all sorts of things that you can work with experience. There's lots of different operational metrics, technical metrics, but you've got to gather sentiment metrics. But don't be scared of doing this. You don't need to go and spend lots and lots of money. You don't need big budgets and all those kind of things to do this. Start your journey. I think, Stuart said earlier, start small and grow. This is going to mature in an organization. So my big takeaway for people is say, well, look at those different types. Think about the ways that Stuart talked about applying it, but then decide where you're going to start your journey off and say, let's just go there for the period of time and let's start this off, and we can mature over time. And maybe 6 months' time, you can buy a different tool, or you can buy in a DEX tool, or you can get a better survey tool, whatever it might be. But don't stop that starting your journey. That's what I would think, big takeaway. Stuart, would you add anything to that?
No, I think the recommendations I said earlier are the takeaways. I completely agree now. I think keep it simple, collaborate, have a joint shared vision for this, what you want to achieve from this, and constantly evaluate what you're doing and how you're doing it. I think to make sure you're getting the outcomes you thought, and that's logical, but I think that's where a lot of people go wrong. They just follow the process rather than actually, we talk about the emotion. A lot of this is about emotion and what we feel, and that's so for people that are used to very much a logical approach, some of this will be very uncomfortable for them. So you may have to culturally get some change programs to change the way people view things and get different people from the organization involved.
Great.
Yeah, fair point.
Thank you for sharing that. Now let's move on to the Q&A. So I know that we've had a question come earlier, which is that if you can only do a couple of things, what should the priority be that improves customer feelings?
Okay, shall I take that?
Go for it, Stuart. Yeah.
So I in my experience, the things that any organization needs to do is to show that you're listening. So whatever mechanisms you've got currently, or if you've got none, is start to show the receivers of this service that you're listening. So if there's any feedback via any mechanism, Go back to these people, show them that you've listened, you want to understand. Let them explain in more detail, contextualize it. So it's nothing worse than you provide valuable time in terms of giving a feedback, but you never hear back from anybody. It's emotionally draining. So you want to make sure that people understand that when they are engaging and when they do give feedback, that it's acted upon and someone's actively listening. So that's the first thing. It's very simple, but it's sometimes very much missed by people. I think then, as we say, we talk about the experience, is get multiple people involved in this who have different approaches to tackling service delivery, customer experience, different personalities, because it's a very emotional thing. You want some logic there, you want some emotion. So try and get a blended team of people from across the organisation. So those were the two things which I'd probably start off with.
And if I was going to say that as well, I would say you're absolutely right. The first thing you do is you've got to, if you're going to start this journey off, you've got to ask people questions about how they feel, right? That's the emotion, and I need to understand how you feel. But once you've understood that, as Stuart said, you've got to listen. You've got to respond. One of the reasons why CSAT surveys don't get high responses because not many people respond to them. You said this, we changed that. So if you've asked people questions, you must listen, you must respond, and then you must act. And if you do that, then more and more people will buy into the process you're trying to achieve, and then and you'll get more and more people responding. You'll get richer data, enabling you to do more and more of the experience. So yeah, only thing I'd add to that, I think.
Great, thank you for that, guys. And then another question that's come through is, does it cost more to do this? And I'd like to pass this over to Stuart.
No, thank you. Not necessarily. I think it's about how heavily you go into this. So, you know, it could be just a time investment, which is a cost to the organisation. You know, how much where are you going to start? How many people are you going to get involved? How much time are you going to invest in the organisation? What backing are you going to give to this? You know, are you going to put your people involved in this on formal experience courses, which you can do, to allow them to go through the process and the frameworks and get education that way? It doesn't need to cost a lot of money. You can start simple, start small, and evolve that. And I always find, from my experience, it's about demonstrating an outcome and a return on it. So if you start small and show actually this small effort will get this small gain, then you demonstrate to the people there's some value by continuing with that. So I don't think necessarily it's about a massive cost. It's about just investment and accountability and desire to actually change things.
Right. And then would a business need to have a large team in order to have any of these services?
Absolutely not, for the very reasons I've just outlined. You can start small. I mean, we have an experience management office consisting of about 4 or 5 people, but you could have somebody with multiple roles in the experience framework. You know, as we do it often in a business, you have multiple hats. So you can start small, and as you start to get success and actually buy-in and the engagement improves, then you can increase the team. But you don't need to do that. And I think, as Neil mentioned earlier, can you outsource it? There's certain elements to the whole experience framework which you can outsource and get other people to do rather than having to build large teams yourself. So, Neil, I don't know if you have any.
I was going to say, yeah, I was going to add to that. I think you're right. You don't need a large team. And again, you know, people might get put off with experience. Oh, we need this big XMO. You don't. I've worked with lots of companies, and they've got virtual teams put in place. I just did an XA engagement with a UK police force, and they've got just a virtual team. And it works really well for them. They're doing really interesting and exciting things. They meet virtually every week, and they meet in person every month. But that's what their XMO is. So there's nobody in it full time as such. It's a virtual time of role. And then you've got organisations that have got more and more people because they're doing more and more things. They've got bigger budgets and so on and so forth. Start in a virtual place. The only thing I would add to that as well is you've got to find an owner, though. You've got to have someone in the business to champion this. If you have nobody in the business to champion it, you're probably not going to go very far with it. You've got to have someone, and hopefully someone on this webinar, you know, to say, I actually really will champion this in my business. And if you have that person, then despite it might be a virtual team and you're borrowing bits and pieces from other people, you'll make great successes. And I've seen it happen. So yeah, you don't need a big team. You do need an owner.
And I think another good question just related to this is that is this mainly just for larger organizations?
No, I think we've just explained why you don't need to be for larger organisations. I think it's for organisations who actually want to understand the experience of their employees. That's the driver, not the size. It's the desire to change.
Yeah, and I suppose just in context, I suppose lots of larger organisations maybe started doing this earlier. Maybe certainly a lot of MSPs like Transputec started doing this because lots of organisations are saying, well, I want you to start measuring my experience. I think there's 2 out of every 3 tenders now mention experience, but actually we're seeing, and Stuart, I know we'll be seeing the same thing. Lots of now smaller companies saying this is important. It doesn't matter kind of the size of the company. If you really want to make people productive in that company, then you've got to measure experience. So no, I'm not saying it's not just exclusive to big companies. I see lots and lots of smaller companies doing it.
Right, thanks for that, Neil. And another question that is more directed towards you is that what technical tools would somebody need?
So it's a good question. So we say there's typically 4 tools, all right? And I'll describe the tools and I'll describe what, don't want to scare people off of that either, but there's 4 tools. You need a decent ITSM tool. And the reason you need a decent ITSM tool is you're going to have to pull out operational data, SLAs and KPIs that might be relevant to experience. You're going to need a survey tool. You're going to need a digital experience tool, like I described earlier in the webinar here. And you're going to need some form of dashboard to bring all that together. Now, that sounds a lot, but you don't need all of that today. And actually, I pretty much guarantee most of you got lots of these already. You already have, if you don't have it, your outsourcer will have it, a decent ITSM tool. That ITSM tool will be able to do surveys. So there's 2 of your tools you've already got in place right now. So you don't need to spend a lot of money. Your ITSM tool will also do surveys. You just need to reconfigure it rather than be on a CSAT type survey, making an experience survey. Perhaps you don't have a DEX tool, so perhaps you want to go to, maybe your outsourcer does. You can buy into that. It could be a good saving for you. Or you might say, I don't have a DEX tool now. Maybe that's a maturity step, and I'll do that next year. So you can start with just your ITSM tool, do some surveys, and grab SLAs and KPIs and match those 2 together to measure experience. And then I talked about a dashboard. You can run a dashboard in Excel if that's the way. In fact, we've done that, and I know customers are using Excel for dashboards because they don't have tools. Or you can use Power BI, which a lot of people have, and just use that and configure that. So when I talk about 4 tools, that would be the ideal situation, but that doesn't mean you need all of them today. And actually, you can repurpose what you've got in place already, I think.
Right, thank you for that, Neil. And then another question that's come through, which I guess is directed more towards me, is that can I get a recording of this? And the answer is yes. So we will be sending you all follow-up emails, and in those we will be sending you replay links. So please look out for those in case you've missed out or would just like to watch it again. And I think this is a good place for us to bring this webinar to a close. And so just before we start, I'd like to pass it over to Stuart because I know he has something sweet to share with everyone.
Yeah, so just wanted to say thank you for everybody for attending today and taking the time to listen to Neil and I and our experiences. What we'd like to offer is that if you're interested in exploring more about experience level agreements, either this is the first time you've heard about it or you're actually halfway through implementation, Neil and I are prepared to offer a 1-hour consultation to discuss how we can move you through that XLA, talk you through the real world examples, and maybe help you on that journey. So if that is of interest to you, please contact us on the details that are on the screen, and Neil and I will be in touch to discuss how we can do that consultation with you, that exercise.
Thank you, Stuart. And alongside that, we've got all of our details on the screen. So please feel free to follow us on LinkedIn or reach out to us via email or direct message. And alongside the free consultation, we're also offering a white paper, which I mentioned earlier, where we go into more in depth about all the topics we've spoken about before. We've also added a few free resources for any of you who are looking to get started. So we've included things such as questions that you should ask your MSP provider to know that you are having a great partnership with them, and what mistake you should be avoiding if you're looking to begin outsourcing. And with that, I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to thank all of you for attending, and thank you, Stuart and Neil, for taking up the time to join us and share all this insightful information with us.
Pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.